The story of Gehrman is one of the most heartbreaking things from software has ever put into a game, and most players walk right past it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I made this video because Gehrman is the character I kept coming back to after finishing Bloodborne. Not the bosses, not the great ones, not even the moon. Gehrman. He's sitting in that workshop from the very first moment you load in, and almost nothing he says makes complete sense until you've seen everything the game has to offer. When I put this together, I made the deliberate choice to follow his story chronologically, starting before the hunt even existed, because I think that's the only way to understand why he ends up where he does. I also chose to leave out a lot of the broader Great One cosmology, not because it isn't relevant, but because this video is specifically about him. What it cost him to build the hunt, what it cost him to lose Maria, and what it means that he's still sitting in that chair, waiting for someone to finally set him free. Chapter 1. The Man Before the Dream. Gehrman did not begin as a prisoner. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him, and it is also the thing the game most quietly conceals. He began as a man. Not a hunter, not a legend, not a relic, a man with a body and a mind and a life that existed before the hunt claimed everything it would eventually claim. Bloodborne gives us very little of this early period in any direct way. There are no journal entries from his youth, no letters written to family, no portraits hanging in some forgotten room. What we have instead are fragments, suggestions, the residue of a person left behind in objects and in the memories of people who knew him when he was still whole. And from those fragments, a picture begins to form of someone who was, for a time, genuinely alive in the way that most of us take for granted. The workshop is where his story, as we can reconstruct it, truly begins. Old Gehrman, before the scourge consumed it, was a city of ambition. The healing church was ascending. The scholars of Byrgenwerth had already begun their dangerous experiments with the old blood, and the city itself was caught between fascination and dread. Gehrman, by most readings of the available evidence, was a craftsman and a fighter both, someone who understood that the emerging threat of the beast plague required a practical response, not simply a theological one. He is believed to have been among the first to recognize that conventional weapons were insufficient and that hunters would need tools specifically designed for the reality they were facing. What this tells us about who Gehrman was before grief reshaped him is that he was a problem solver. He saw a crisis and he built a response to it. The trick weapons that define Bloodborne's combat, those remarkable transforming arms that shift between forms with a flick of the wrist, those are his legacy. He designed them or contributed substantially to their design. That is not a small thing. It represents a mind that was both creative and tactical, someone who could hold a vision of what a tool needed to accomplish, and then engineer it into existence. That kind of person is not typically defined by passivity or resignation. They are defined by agency, by the belief that problems can be solved if you apply the right kind of thinking. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because the Gehrman we meet in the game is almost the opposite of that person. The figure in the wheelchair, mumbling in the dream, is defined entirely by his inability to act on his own behalf. He is the most powerful hunter in the history of Gehrman, the first among them, and he cannot leave a garden. Something took the man who built the tools of the hunt and turned him into a ghost haunting its periphery. Understanding that transformation is what this video is about. The workshop he built, the physical one, in Old Gehrman was apparently a gathering place. Hunters came there to learn, to repair their weapons, to receive guidance. Gehrman was its centre. He was, by all available evidence, a teacher as much as a fighter, someone who understood that the hunt required more than individual skill. It required an institution, a tradition, a way of passing knowledge forward so that each generation of hunters wouldn't have to rediscover everything from scratch. This instinct toward building something lasting is reflected in the dream workshop, which is modelled after the real one in exacting detail. Even in his imprisonment, he recreated the space where he was once most fully himself. The weapons left in the hunter's dream workshop are not random. They are the foundational tools of the hunt, things Gehrman presumably had a hand in developing or at minimum in teaching. The saw cleaver, blunt and brutal, designed for tearing. The hunter axe, heavy and deliberate. The threaded cane, elegant and adaptable. Each one tells you something about the philosophy of hunting he developed, which was essentially that flexibility was survival. A hunter who could only fight one way was a hunter who would eventually encounter something that way didn't work on. You needed options. You needed the capacity to shift. There's a reading of Gehrman's entire arc that begins right here. With this philosophy, because it is a philosophy, he eventually stopped being able to apply to his own situation. He built a system of adaptive thinking for others to use, and then found himself utterly unable to adapt to his own circumstances. He became the one variable in his own system that he couldn't account for. That irony sits at the heart of everything that follows. Before Maria, before the choir, before the night of the hunt became something monstrous, there was simply this: a man with a workshop and a vision. He believed the hunt could be managed. He believed that with the right tools and the right training, Gehrman's hunters could hold the line between humanity and something worse. He was wrong, ultimately, but he wasn't foolish for believing it. The scourge was not yet what it would become. The healing church had not yet made its most catastrophic decisions. The world had not yet fully revealed what it intended to do. He built the workshop in a period of relative hope, which is to say, he built it in a period that was about to end. This is one of the quieter tragedies of Gehrman's story, the fact that his most productive years, the years when he was actually building something, were the years immediately before the collapse. He created the institutional foundation of the hunt just in time for the hunt to become something he never intended. He handed others tools and then watched those tools be used in ways he could not have fully anticipated. The healing church adopted his hunters, or at least the practice of hunting, and formalized it into something that served the church's interests as much as the city's safety. This is a recurring pattern in Bloodborne's world, where individuals create things in good faith that are then absorbed by larger power structures and bent toward other purposes. Gehrman built hunters. The church built an apparatus around them, and somewhere in that gap between his intention and the church's application, something was lost that could never quite be recovered. His relationship with the church was apparently cooperative, but not fully aligned. He was not a theologian or a true believer in the transformative power of the old blood. He was a pragmatist who understood that the blood was a tool, useful and also dangerous, something to be handled carefully rather than celebrated. The church, as it matured, moved towards celebration. This divergence didn't destroy anything immediately, but it created a fault line that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The hunters he trained were, in many ways, extensions of his own philosophy. They were meant to be practical, adaptable, effective, and ultimately expendable in the service of a cause larger than any individual. That last part, the expendability, is something he seems to have genuinely believed in when he was building the system. People die in the hunt. That is the cost of what the hunt requires. A good hunter accepts that cost and moves forward. This is a reasonable position when you are the one designing the system rather than being destroyed by it. It becomes considerably harder to maintain when the person who is lost is someone you love. What we know about Gehrman's emotional life before Maria is mostly inference. He was, by the evidence available, a person who cared deeply about the craft and about the people who took it up. The weapons he built were not just functional, they were considered. They were made by someone who thought about what a hunter would actually need in a real fight, not just what would look impressive or what would satisfy a theoretical ideal. That kind of attention to the practical welfare of others is not the behaviour of a cold or indifferent person. He was also, the evidence suggests, someone who formed genuine attachments. This matters because the destruction of attachment is what ultimately undoes him. A person who never attached to anything cannot be broken by loss in the same way. Gehrman's tragedy requires that he was first fully human, which means he was first fully capable of caring about something more than he cared about himself. The early hunt had a different character than what it became. It was brutal, yes, and the scourge of beasts was genuine and terrible. But the hunters of that early period were, by most readings, motivated by something that resembled actual protection. They were fighting for the city. They were fighting for the people in it. The moral clarity of that early period, whatever its limitations, gave the hunt a coherence that it would gradually lose as the church's agenda expanded and the old blood's true nature began to reveal itself. Gehrman presided over that early period and shaped it. His values became the foundational values of the institution, even as the institution later departed from them. This is another way his tragedy compounds over time. He created something good and then watched it drift away from what he made it. He couldn't stop the drift, and eventually couldn't even really participate in responding to it, because by the time the worst departures happened, he was already locked in the dream. There is something in the physical design of the hunter's dream that speaks to Gehrman's character in this early period. The workshop there is immaculate. Everything is in its place. The tools are organised, ready, cared for. This is not the environment of someone who has given up on the project of craftsmanship. Even in his imprisonment, he maintains the space with something that resembles pride of ownership. The man who built the original workshop is still visible in the person who maintains its dream replica. But there's also a stillness to it that is different from order. A workshop in active use is slightly chaotic. Things get moved, left out, put down in the wrong place because someone was in a hurry. The hunter's dream workshop doesn't quite have that quality. It is ordered in the way that a memorial is ordered, in the way that a space is organised when no one is actually working in it anymore. It is the simulacrum of productivity, not the real thing. This is what Gehrman has become by the time we meet him, the simulacrum of the man he used to be. The shape of the workshop master, the first hunter, the teacher and craftsman, but hollowed out. What fills that hollow is grief and guilt and the particular madness of someone who has been kept alive far past the natural end of their story. Before all of that, though, he was simply a man who was good at something important and who was trying to do it well. He had colleagues and students and probably friends. He had a sense of purpose. He woke up in the morning with work to do that he believed mattered. The hunt was not yet his prison. It was his calling. That is the person the doll is made in the image of, though in an oblique and complicated way. That is the person whose tools are laid out in the workshop. That is the person who somewhere underneath all the layers of trauma and captivity and guilt still exists in some form in the figure of the old man in the wheelchair. And it is that person, the one who existed before everything collapsed, who makes his tragedy actually land. Because you cannot grieve what was never there. You cannot mourn a loss that was never a possession. Gehrman's tragedy requires the existence of Gehrman before the tragedy, which is why this is where the story has to begin. With the man, with the workshop, with the moment before the collapse that he couldn't see coming and probably wouldn't have believed if someone had described it to him. He was building something, he believed in it, and then the world showed him what belief costs when it meets reality. The tools remain, the building remains. The institution he founded continues in warped and unrecognizable form long after he loses access to it. In that sense, he succeeded. In every other sense that mattered to him personally, the success was the beginning of everything that destroyed him. This is where Bloodborne starts, not in the waking world of Gehrman, not in the hunter's dream, but here, in the story of a man who built something and lost everything in the building of it. Every other element of the game flows from this centre. Every mystery, every horror, every desperate act of the night is downstream of decisions made and costs paid and losses suffered by a craftsman with a workshop and a vision. He made the tools. He trained the hunters. He believed the hunt was manageable. He was wrong. And the wrongness of that belief is what everything else is built on. The man before the dream was someone worth knowing, someone worth mourning, someone who deserved better than what the world and his own choices and other people's madness would eventually give him. He didn't get better. Almost no one in Bloodborne does, but the fact that he deserved better is what makes the telling of his story something other than mere horror. It makes it a tragedy, and tragedies, properly told, require you to understand what was lost before they can show you the losing of it. So, the man before the dream, remember him, because the dream is coming, and once it arrives, he will never quite be that man again. Chapter 2. Lady Maria and what she meant to him. If Gehrman is the tragedy, Maria is the wound at the centre of it. She appears in the base game only as a ghost, her name spoken by the old man, with an aching softness that tells you everything before you know anything. In the Old Hunters DLC, she becomes something more concrete, and in some ways more devastating, a presence so strong that even death hasn't fully extinguished her. But to understand what she meant to Gehrman, you have to try to understand what she was before she became a memory that broke him. Maria was not simply a student. The game suggests something more complicated than that. A relationship that was professional and mentorial and also deeply personal in ways that may or may not have involved romantic feeling, depending on how you read the evidence. What is clear is that she mattered to Gehrman in a way that went beyond the ordinary attachment of teacher to pupil. She was, in some sense, the person he invested the most of himself in, and that investment, when it was severed, took something irreplaceable with it. She was a hunter of exceptional capability by all available evidence. Her Rakuyo weapon, a paired set of hunter tools that represent some of the most technically demanding fighting in the game, tells you that she was not a mediocre student who was elevated by Gehrman's affection. She was genuinely talented. She earned her place among the best hunters of her generation through skill and dedication, not through favoritism. This matters because it means Gehrman's attachment to her wasn't a projection of who he wanted her to be. He was seeing something real. She was also, the evidence suggests, a person of genuine moral seriousness. Her abandonment of her weapons, the casting away of the Rakuyo at the bottom of the fishing hamlet well, points towards someone who reached a point of ethical crisis she could not resolve by continuing to fight. The fishing hamlet atrocities, the massacre of the village, and the transformation of its inhabitants into whatever the fishing hamlet enemies represent, seem to have been the breaking point for her. She participated in something she could not justify, and her response was to stop. This combination, exceptional skill paired with genuine conscience, is exactly the kind of person Gehrman would have prized above all others. He built the hunt to be something worthy of moral investment. He designed it to be a response to a real threat, not a vehicle for atrocity. A student who both embodied the skill he valued and took seriously the ethics he presumably cared about would have been, for someone like Gehrman, something close to a vindication of everything he was trying to build. And then she died. The exact circumstances of her death are not fully clear from the available lore, which is typical of Bloodborne's approach to the most painful things. What is clear is that she died in the hunt, as hunters do, and that her death had consequences for Gehrman that the game presents as foundational to his current state. She is the reason the doll was made. She is the reason the dream exists in the form that it does. She is, in a very real sense, the reason Gehrman is the broken thing we encounter when we arrive. The doll is perhaps the most direct evidence of what Maria meant to him. Gehrman built the doll in her likeness, though the game is careful to note that the doll is not Maria and does not pretend to be. The doll has Maria's face and Maria's general form, but not Maria's memories or Maria's identity. She is something else entirely, a created being who exists in the dream to provide company and mechanical function. Gehrman tells us, in one of his more lucid moments, that he made the doll so that he would have someone to talk to in the dream, that he felt lonely. The loneliness he's describing is not the ordinary loneliness of isolation, though the isolation of the dream is certainly real and certainly terrible. It is the specific loneliness of a person who has lost the one presence that made the world feel inhabitable, and who has responded by creating an echo of that presence, because even an echo is better than nothing. This is one of the most quietly devastating things in Bloodborne. The doll, who is kind and gentle and genuinely caring in her own right, began as an act of grief so profound that Gehrman could not simply accept the loss. He had to build something to stand in for what he'd lost. The fact that the doll knows this and seems to have made peace with being what she is one of the kinder things in the game. She is not bitter about being a replacement. She does not resent the fact that her existence is rooted in someone else's grief. She simply is what she is and offers what she can offer. In some ways, she has achieved a kind of equanimity that Gehrman himself never manages, but there's something troubling in the act of making her too. By building the doll in Maria's image, Gehrman did something that goes beyond mourning. He froze Maria in place, he took a dead person and made her into a kind of permanent presence in his prison, looking the way he remembered her, available in the way she could no longer be available. This is not healthy grief. This is the behaviour of someone who cannot accept that the loss is permanent, or who accepts it intellectually but cannot accept it emotionally, and so builds a workaround. Maria herself, if the DLC is anything to go by, had complicated feelings about her own memory being used this way. Her boss encounter, if read as the memory of Maria rather than Maria herself, is not hostile in a simple way. She fights you, yes, but the nature of the fight and the things she says during it suggest something more like a person who is exhausted by being conjured back into awareness and who needs, finally, to be allowed to rest. There is a reading of her boss fight as a mercy, which mirrors the mercy Gehrman asks for when you finally face him. The people closest to each other in life both need to be released in death. They are both imprisoned by the refusal of the world to let them go. What did Maria think of Gehrman? The game doesn't give us direct access to her perspective on him, which is frustrating but probably intentional. She was his most accomplished student, and presumably she respected him for the same reasons the evidence suggests she deserved to be respected. Whether her feelings went beyond respect in either direction, toward deeper affection or toward the disillusionment that her later actions suggest she felt about the hunt and its leaders, is genuinely unclear. What seems likely, given her decision to leave her weapons behind and presumably end her participation in the kind of hunting that led to the fishing hamlet, is that she experienced some kind of rupture with the world Gehrman had built, not necessarily with Gehrman personally, but with the institution and its consequences. She seems to have looked at what the hunt had become, what the healing church had made it into, what the thirst for knowledge had justified doing to people who couldn't fight back, and decided she could not continue to be part of it. This decision is heroic in its way, but it also represents a rejection of the life Gehrman had shaped her for. That rejection, whether or not he experienced it as personal, must have registered as something significant. He had built a student who was good enough to be an extension of his own legacy, and that student had concluded that the legacy wasn't worth extending. There is a version of this that is deeply painful for a teacher to process. The moment when your best student outgrows not just you, but the values you instilled, and finds them insufficient. Whether Gehrman had that kind of complex response to Maria's withdrawal from the hunt, or whether he simply loved her and lost her and was destroyed by the losing, is one of the things the game deliberately leaves unresolved. The two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A person can be your greatest student and your most profound personal loss at the same time. In fact, the entanglement of those two things might be part of what makes the loss so complete for Gehrman. After she died, he made the doll. He was then taken into the dream by the moon presence, and the dream became his prison. The sequencing here is important. The doll was made in the waking world, in the real workshop in Old Gehrman, before the dream existed in its current form, which means the act of making her was something Gehrman did as a free man, as someone still capable of taking action in the physical world. He used that freedom to create a monument to his grief, and then he was imprisoned, and the monument came with him. The doll in the dream is therefore not just a companion. She is the physical evidence, or the dream evidence, of the last thing Gehrman chose to make, when he still had choices. Of all the things he could have done with his remaining freedom, what he made was a version of Maria. What he built with the agency he had left was an act of love, and also an act of refusal, refusing to let her be simply gone, refusing to accept the world without her in it. This is deeply human. It is also deeply unwise, and the dream has given him centuries to understand, over and over, that no amount of building can bring back a dead person. The doll is wonderful in her way, but she is not Maria, and Gehrman, who made her, who talks to her, who presumably finds some comfort in her presence, has never managed to stop knowing that she isn't. The hunting grounds of Bloodborne are full of people who have lost themselves trying to find something that can't be found, or make something that can't be made. Gehrman is the oldest instance of this pattern in the game. He was the first to suffer the particular madness of the dream, and he's been suffering it the longest, and his madness has at its centre the most ordinary human thing, the inability to accept that someone he loved is gone. Maria died as hunters die. The scourge, the beast, the night, one of these things or some combination of them ended her. And Gehrman, who built the system that put her in harm's way, who trained her for the hunt that killed her, who believed that the hunt was worth the cost, had to live with the fact that he had, in some sense, prepared her for her own death. That guilt, the specific guilt of a teacher who outlives their student and suspects their own role in the student's death, is something that would destroy a person even under ordinary circumstances. Gehrman's circumstances are not ordinary. He has been in the dream for what appears to be centuries. He has watched hunter after hunter come and go, trained them, equipped them, sent them out. He has done this while sitting in the garden that contains the monument he built to the loss that is still, after all this time, the central fact of his existence. Every hunter who passes through the dream is, in some sense, a reminder of Maria. Not because any of them are here, but because all of them are what she was. Young, capable, going out to fight something that might kill them, and Gehrman, who knows what it costs when the hunt kills someone it shouldn't, has to help them anyway. He has to maintain the pretense of the dream, equip the hunters, send them out, watch them potentially not come back, over and over. This is part of what has broken him. Not just the loss of Maria, but the eternal repetition of the circumstances that led to her loss, filtered through the dream's strange unreality. He cannot grieve and move on, because the dream never lets him fully move on. He is always and forever the teacher preparing students for danger, which is always and forever the role he occupied when Maria died. The wound does not close. The circumstances that opened it keep recurring, and he sits in his chair and tends the workshop, and tries in his mumbling, half-coherent way to be useful to whoever the dream has sent him this time. Lady Maria, and what she meant to him is, at its simplest, this. She was the person who taught him that the hunt's costs were not abstract, that the expendability he had built into the system's philosophy was a real expendability, not a theoretical one. that someone he loved could be spent, and that he, who had designed the system that spent her, would have to carry that knowledge forever. He carries it still, in the garden, in the chair, in the face of the doll. Chapter 3. The Moon. Presence and the Making of the Prison. To understand what happened to Gehrman, you have to first accept that Bloodborne's world contains things for which human categories are simply insufficient. The moon presence is one of those things. It is, in the language the game sometimes uses, a great one, a being of such fundamental otherness that describing what it wants or what it does in ordinary terms is itself a kind of distortion. But the game does give us enough to sketch the shape of what happened between Gehrman and the moon presence, and that shape is, in its own way, more comprehensible than it might initially seem. The moon presence came to Gehrman. This is the operative fact. It did not find him randomly. It sought him specifically. The first hunter, the master of the workshop, the person who had built the institutional foundation of the hunt. Whatever the moon presence needed from a human being, Gehrman was apparently the right human being for it. The question of why it chose him, and what it chose him for, is one of the central mysteries the game circles around without fully resolving. One reading, and it is a reading that the game strongly supports, is that the moon presence needed a warden. The hunter's dream serves, among other functions, as a mechanism for producing hunters and cycling them into Yharnam's endless night. Hunters die, return to the dream, prepare themselves, go back out. The dream is the staging ground for the hunt, and someone has to manage it. Gehrman was the person who had already, in the waking world, been managing something very similar. He was the natural candidate, but this reading, while accurate, understates the violence of what was done to him. Being chosen for a role is not the same as consenting to it. The moon presence did not, as far as the game suggests, ask Gehrman if he wanted to be the warden of the dream. It made him the warden. It took him with his grief and his guilt and his workshop, and it built a prison around him and called that prison the hunter's dream. The beauty of the dream, the carefully tended flowers and the warm light does not change what it fundamentally is. A place Gehrman cannot leave. The moon presence is not presented as straightforwardly evil in the game, which makes it more disturbing, not less. It is alien. It has a relationship to human well-being that is not hostile in the way a monster is hostile. It is indifferent in a more complete way, the way a vast force of nature is indifferent. It does not take Gehrman as a prisoner because it enjoys his suffering. It takes him because it needs something from him, and the question of whether he suffers in the process is simply not part of its calculation. There is a reading of this that is almost bureaucratic, which is the most unsettling reading. The moon presence needed a particular function performed. Gehrman was the optimal candidate for performing it. He was placed in the dream, and the dream was placed under his stewardship. Any suffering this caused was incidental. Any loneliness or guilt or grief he experienced in the dream was simply not a relevant variable in the Great One's equation. The dream itself is, by all available evidence, a genuine construction of the moon presence. It is not a natural space or a physical location that was repurposed. It is something that was made, deliberately, in a form that would be legible and somewhat comfortable for a human being. The flowers, the warm light, the workshop, these are not accidents. They are elements of a constructed environment designed to be habitable for the specific human being who is going to spend what would turn out to be centuries there. This attention to Gehrman's comfort, paradoxically, makes the trap more complete. He is not in a dungeon, he is in a garden. He has a space that resembles the place where he was most himself. He has the tools he built and the workshop he designed, and later, the doll he made to ease his loneliness. He has, in a material sense, everything except freedom. And freedom is the only thing that matters when everything else is given to you as a way of keeping you in place. The moon presence's choice of Gehrman is also, possibly, connected to his specific grief. A man who has just lost the person most important to him and who is drowning in guilt about his role in that loss is, in certain specific ways, an easier candidate for eternal service than a man who has something to return to. Gehrman, at the moment the moon presence found him, had already lost the thing that would have made him fight hardest for his freedom. He was already, in some sense, partially abandoned by the world he was being taken from. This is not to say the moon presence exploited his grief in a calculated way. It is more that his grief made him available in a way that a less broken person might not have been. He had nothing left to fight for, with the same ferocity he might have had before Maria died. The dream offered him, in a terrible way, something to do with his loss, something to organize his remaining existence around. He could not bring her back. He could not undo what the hunt had cost, but he could manage the hunt staging ground. He could prepare the hunters who came after her. He could maintain the workshop she had trained in. The prison was built to fit him specifically. That is perhaps the most disturbing thing about it. It is not a generic confinement. It is a confinement designed around his particular psychology, his particular history, his particular needs. The moon presence understood enough about Gehrman to build a space that would hold him, not through force, but through the more subtle mechanism of giving him just enough that he wouldn't tear the whole thing apart, trying to escape. And it worked. For what appears to be centuries. He has been there through the rise and fall of generations of hunters. He has watched the city of Gehrman spiral further and further into the madness that the healing church and the old blood produced. He has done his job, preparing hunter after hunter, maintaining the dream's functions, while the thing that should have been at the centre of his existence, actual life in the actual world, continued without him. The moon presence visits him. This is suggested by certain aspects of the dream's structure and by the nature of Gehrman's captivity. The relationship between them is not one of complete abandonment on the Great One's part. It is more like the relationship between a keeper and something kept, periodic attention that ensures the arrangement continues to function. Gehrman is checked on because he is useful. His suffering is noted, if it is noted at all, as a byproduct of the arrangement rather than a concern in its own right. There is something almost feudal about this relationship, though that comparison can only go so far. The moon presence has given Gehrman a domain to manage. He manages it, the domain is terrible, and he is trapped in it, but it is his in some sense. The tools in the workshop are his. The flowers in the garden were presumably tended by him at some point, or perhaps they grow on their own in the dream's strange logic. The hunters who come through are, in a sense, his responsibility. He is the first and last hunter, the alpha and omega of the institution he built, and the moon presence has arranged things so that this will continue indefinitely. The question that this raises, and that the game does raise in a quiet way, is whether Gehrman's continued service is willing. Does he keep doing what the moon presence requires, because he has accepted his role, because resistance is simply not possible, or because some part of him has decided that the work is worth doing even from within a prison? The game suggests it might be all three of these things, at different times that Gehrman's relationship to his own captivity is complex and has shifted over the centuries. There are moments when he seems genuinely invested in the well-being of the hunters who come through the dream. He gives advice, he offers concern, he warns you about the danger of the night in a way that suggests he actually cares whether you survive. This is not the behaviour of someone who has completely surrendered to being a tool. There is still something in him that engages with the hunt as something worth caring about, but there are also moments of profound weariness. The thing about Gehrman's dialogue is that underneath everything else, there is exhaustion. Not the ordinary exhaustion of someone who is tired after a long day, the exhaustion of someone who has been tired for a very long time and has no expectation that it will end. He is tired in his bones, tired in a way that has become so familiar that he has stopped fully registering it as a state that could be different. The moon presence made him into something that will last as long as it needs him to last. Whatever age and natural decay would normally have brought to a man of Gehrman's years has been suspended by the dream's logic. He continues. He remains. He tends the workshop and talks to the doll and prepares the hunters and waits. He has been waiting for a very long time for something he cannot quite name, something that feels like it might be release, though the concept of release requires a prior concept of captivity that he has perhaps stopped allowing himself to fully acknowledge, because to fully acknowledge that you are a prisoner is to accept that freedom is a real thing that exists somewhere outside your walls. And Gehrman, who has been in the dream for long enough to have lost count of the generations of hunters he has helped prepare, may have made a practical peace with not allowing himself to want what he cannot have. The moon presence and the making of the prison. It is not a dramatic story of conquest or battle, or even of explicit violence. It is quieter and more mundane, and therefore more terrible. A being of vast power needed something. A man was available. A garden was built. The man was placed in the garden, and the gate was locked, and time continued in the way that time continues, when no one is doing anything to stop it. And Gehrman tends the flowers and waits. Chapter 4. Centuries in the Garden. Time does something to people. This is true in the ordinary way, the way that decades reshape a face and slow a body and accumulate losses until the person who exists at 60 or 70 is recognizably different from the person who existed at 20. But the dream does something else to time, something that doesn't map cleanly onto the ordinary experience of aging. Gehrman has been in the garden for what appears to be a very long time enough for the city of Gehrman above to rise and change and calcify into the particular madness we encounter when the game begins. Time enough for generations of hunters to pass through the dream and out into the world, and mostly not return. Time enough for the workshop to become a memorial to itself. What does that much time do to a person? The game gives us Gehrman as he is at the end of all this, not at the beginning and not at the middle, and it is worth trying to reconstruct what the arc of those centuries might have looked like. He was not always the figure in the wheelchair. At some point he was someone who had just arrived in the dream, still new to his captivity, still possibly fighting it in some internal way, even if external resistance was impossible. The first period of his captivity was probably the most acute. He had just lost Maria. He had just been taken by the moon presence. The grief and the disorientation would have been simultaneous, each making the other worse. He was in a space that was familiar in its physical details, but fundamentally alien in its nature. The dream is not the real world. It operates by different rules. Things that should decay don't. Things that should grow or change remain fixed. The light is always the same light. The flowers are always the same flowers. The workshop is always ready with the same tools. For a craftsman, for someone whose engagement with the world was fundamentally about making things and seeing them change over time, this fixity must have been its own particular torture. He could not build anything new. He could maintain what was there, repair tools, tend the garden, but the fundamental creative act of making something and watching it become real was unavailable to him in the dream's static world. He made the doll, and the doll was perhaps the last genuinely new thing he created, and then there was nothing left to make. The doll's presence in the early period of his captivity must have been both a comfort and a constant reminder of what prompted her creation. She was there because Maria wasn't. Every time he saw her face, which was Maria's face, he was seeing the reason for his grief and the evidence of his grief simultaneously. This would be, over time, deeply strange to live with. Not painful in the acute way of the first loss, but painful in the chronic way of a wound that has become part of the body's normal state, something you no longer fully register as pain because you have nothing to compare it to. Hunter after hunter came through the dream. This is perhaps the most important feature of those centuries. Gehrman was not alone in the simple sense. The dream was regularly populated by the hunters of whatever generation was currently fighting the night in Gehrman above. He interacted with them. He equipped them. He, in his role as the dream's warden, gave them what they needed to continue. But these interactions were structured by the fundamental asymmetry of his situation. They were passing through. He was staying. The hunters who came through the dream were not, from Gehrman's perspective, real companions. They were transients. They came, they prepared, they went back out. Many of them didn't come back. The ones who did come back came back different, changed by what they'd encountered, moving further and further along the arc of insight or madness that Bloodborne treats as, essentially, the same thing at sufficient extremes. And then they, too, were gone. And Gehrman remained. This pattern, the constant arrival and departure of people he could not truly connect with because they were always moving and he was always staying, would have produced over time a particular kind of isolation. Not the isolation of someone who has no contact with others. The isolation of someone who has contact with others but cannot form the kind of continuous, deepening relationship that actually sustains a person. He knew many hunters. He probably knew something about each of them, their ways of fighting, their fears, their particular relationship with the night. But he couldn't keep them. They all left, and he stayed, and the garden went on being the same garden. The wheelchair is interesting as a symptom of something. Gehrman is the most accomplished hunter in the history of Gehrman, and he is in a wheelchair. This is not simply a matter of physical infirmity, or not only that. There is a reading of the wheelchair as the physical expression of something that happened to him over the course of his captivity, a retreat from active engagement with his own existence. He who was built for movement, for the fluid, deadly motion of the hunter, has become stationary. He who designed weapons for adaptability has become fixed. He who once moved between fighting and crafting and teaching is now sitting. The sitting is not just waiting. It is, in a sense, the physical form of a decision that was made gradually over a very long time, the decision to stop fighting the situation he was in. Not to give up on the hunt, not to abandon his responsibility to the hunters who came through, but to stop expending energy on resistance that was going nowhere. The wheelchair is the form his acceptance took. He accepted it by sitting down. There are moments in his dialogue where you can hear the man he was trying to reassert himself. When he talks about the tools of the hunt, there is something like genuine enthusiasm, or the memory of genuine enthusiasm, still accessible to him. He knows the weapons he made better than anyone living. He knows their history and their purpose and their limitations. When he talks about these things, the craftsman is briefly visible under the ruin. But these moments are surrounded by the longer, more characteristic mumbling, the voices he uses when he's not quite fully present, the sentences that begin coherently and drift into something that makes sense in its own internal logic, but not quite in ordinary conversational terms. Gehrman has been in the dream long enough for the boundaries between his mind and the dream's reality to have become somewhat permeable. He is not mad in the way that some Bloodborne characters are mad, not completely detached from recognizable humanity, but he is not entirely intact either. The specific detail of him mistaking the player for students is particularly striking. He calls you by names or by the generic address of student, and the confusion is not the confusion of someone who has forgotten that you're new. It is the confusion of someone who has had so many students that the individual ones have started to blur together. He has helped so many hunters that the individual identities have become less distinct. What remains is the category student, hunter, person who needs preparing. The individual is less present to him than the role. This is another thing that centuries in the garden have done to him. The people have become not quite abstractions, but less individually distinct than they once were. He still cares. The care is genuine and evident. But the texture of individual relationship, The specific way that knowing one particular person is different from knowing another has been worn smooth by the sheer number of people he has known and lost. There is something Buddhist in this, though not in a way Gehrman himself could access or probably appreciate. The dissolution of individual attachment in the face of accumulated experience, the way enough of anything blurs the distinctions between instances of it. He has known so many hunters that they have become hunter in his mind. He has experienced so much grief that it has become the baseline rather than the exception. He has been so long in the dream that the dream has become reality, and the waking world, if he can still fully conceptualize it, has become the abstraction. The garden itself is worth examining as a space that reflects what the centuries have done to him. It is immaculate. The flowers bloom perpetually. The light is gentle and constant. Everything about it suggests a kind of arrested perfection, which is its own category of horror. A real garden changes. It has seasons. Plants die and new ones grow. The light shifts. Things are messy and alive and in process. The dream garden is none of these things. It is perfect and static and beautiful in a way that excludes the kind of beauty that comes from change. Gehrman maintains this garden. He tends it. Whatever that means in the logic of the dream, he has spent centuries in a relationship with a space that cannot actually respond to his tending. He cannot make it better. He cannot watch it grow. He can only maintain it in the state it is always in, which is to say, he can perform the motions of care without the outcomes that make those motions meaningful. This is what his centuries in the garden have made of him, a person going through the motions of a life without the substance of one, a craftsman maintaining tools for work he no longer performs, a teacher prepared for students who are always transient, a man who loves someone he can no longer reach, tending a garden that will not change in a dream that has no exit. He is exhausted. This cannot be overstated. The kind of exhaustion he carries is not something most people encounter because most people do not live long enough to accumulate it. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been present for too much for too long without the mercy of ending. He has not been allowed to finish. He is always still going, still performing the function the moon presence requires, still present in the garden. If he still feels things in the way he once did, those feelings have been so compressed by time that they are barely distinguishable from the general ache that is his baseline existence. The grief about Maria is still there. This is evident in the way he speaks of her, or of the doll with a softness that nothing else in his manner quite has. But it is a very old grief. It has been worn smooth by centuries of being carried. It doesn't cut the same way. It has simply become part of the weight he carries, indistinguishable from all the other weight. And yet he still gets up every night, metaphorically speaking, in a place where night and day mean something different. He still tends the workshop. He still equips the hunters. He still offers what guidance he can. He still cares in his diminished, exhausted, centuries-worn way about what happens to the people who pass through his garden. That is not nothing. In fact, that is almost everything. The man who could have simply stopped, who could have retreated entirely into the dream's pleasant, static beauty and simply ceased to engage, has not quite done that. He is still here, still trying, still present, however incompletely, to the people who need him. Centuries in the garden, and he is still trying. That is the thing about Gehrman that is easy to miss if you take his deteriorated state at face value. The deterioration is real. The damage is real. The centuries have done to him exactly what you would expect them to do to a person kept in an unchanging space, with no genuine companionship and no prospect of release. But he hasn't stopped. He hasn't stopped. Chapter 5. The Hunters He Made and Lost. Every hunter who's passed through the dream is, in a sense, Gehrman's, not in any proprietary or controlling way, but in the way that a teacher's students are theirs. carrying something forward that the teacher gave them and using it in the world in ways the teacher might not always anticipate. Gehrman built the institution of the hunt. He designed its tools and its practices and its philosophy. Every person who picked up a hunter's weapon and went into the night of Gehrman was, at least partially, a product of what he built. Some of these hunters he knew personally, in the waking world before the dream, or in the dream itself during the long centuries of his captivity. Some he only knew as presences passing through, people who came to prepare and went back out. Some he will have known well, having spent real time with them, having something close to actual relationship with them during the periods when a hunter might linger in the dream before going back. And some he will barely have registered as individuals. They will have been simply the latest in the long sequence of hunters that the dream receives and dispatches. The ones he knew best, presumably, were the early ones, the hunters of his own generation, the ones he trained in the original workshop before the dream existed. Some of these people may have also ended up in the dream eventually, if the dream was functioning during their lifetime, and if they met the particular conditions that brought hunters there. This would have meant, for Gehrman, encountering people he had known in the full reality of the waking world within the diminished reality of the dream. People who remembered him as he was, not as he has become. These encounters, if they happened, must have been complicated. There is a particular kind of pain in being seen by someone who knew you before you were broken. They carry the image of who you were, alongside the evidence of who you have become, and the comparison is visible in their eyes even when they are too kind to speak it. For Gehrman, who must be aware of what the dream has done to him, even if he cannot fully reverse it, being seen by people from the before would have been both comfort and torment. Maria was of this generation, or close enough to it that the distinction barely matters. She trained with him. She knew him at his most capable, and she died before the worst of the dream's long work on him was complete. She knew a Gehrman who was still, largely, himself. The Gehrman she knew and the Gehrman who sits in the wheelchair are the same person, but they are separated by centuries of a captivity she didn't have to witness. The later hunters, the ones who came through the dream long after the waking world's connection to the first generation of hunters had been severed, would have known only the dream Gehrman. The old man in the workshop, the teacher who spoke of the hunt with a mix of genuine knowledge and unmistakable damage. These hunters, presumably, understood that there was something wrong with Gehrman without necessarily understanding what had caused it or how long it had been going on. He would have seemed, to them, like a person who had seen too much. Which is accurate, as far as it goes. The hunters Gehrman sent out and watched not return, these are a special category of loss. The ones who came into the dream and prepared and went out, and then simply were gone, with no body to recover, and no final conversation, and no ending that Gehrman could witness. These are the ones that would have accumulated into something crushing over the centuries. Not each individually, though individual losses surely registered when they involved someone he had come to know, but collectively, as a pattern. The pattern of people arriving and leaving and not returning. He sent Maria out. He had sent her out into the hunt, equipped and capable and ready, and she had not come back. And then afterward, in the dream, he had sent out hunter after hunter, in an echo of that original sending, each one a potential repetition of the loss he had already suffered, each one a reminder of what it costs when someone doesn't come back. There is no evidence that Gehrman made a practice of staying distant from the hunters who came through, of protecting himself from the repetition of that loss by refusing to engage individually with the people in his care. The available evidence suggests the opposite, that he continued to care about individual hunters, even knowing what caring about them might cost. This is either evidence of profound generosity of spirit or evidence of an inability to protect himself from predictable pain. Probably both. The doll cares about the hunters too. This is one of the ways she extends or embodies what is best in Gehrman. She is kind to everyone who comes through the dream, attentive and warm in a way that is genuine rather than performed. This quality did not come from nowhere. It came from Gehrman, who made her, and who presumably made her to be the kind of presence he wanted in the dream, the kind of presence he was trying to be himself. The doll is a better version of the companion he wanted, uncomplicated by grief and guilt and centuries of damage. What this suggests is that, even at the most broken point of his captivity, when he created the doll, he was still oriented toward care. He was still trying to build something that would be good for the people who came through. He was damaged and lonely and imprisoned, and what he used his creative energy for was making a being who could be kind to others. That tells you something essential about Gehrman that the ruins of the present moment can obscure. The specific hunters we encounter in the game's lore are mostly products of the later period of the dream's operation. Simon the Harrowed, who appears in the Old Hunters, is someone who has a complicated relationship with the hunt and with what it has become, but he is not one of Gehrman's original students. The Powder Kegs, the Workshop Hunters, the various factions that developed within the broader culture of hunting, these all have their roots in what Gehrman built, but they are several generations removed from him. The institution outlived its creator in the specific sense that the practices and tools he developed took on lives of their own that exceeded his influence. Hunters fight in ways that trace back to his designs, without knowing his name or his story. The workshop tradition, the concept of trick weapons, the specific philosophy of adaptive combat, these persist because Gehrman was right about what the hunt needed. He built something that worked. The tragedy is that it worked in contexts, and for purposes he never intended, but the underlying rightness of the design is evident in its longevity. Jura, the old hunter of Old Yarnham, who is encountered keeping watch over the beasts below, is in some ways the most direct echo of Gehrman available in the waking world during the game. He is someone who has seen the hunt from the inside and has reached a position of profound ambivalence about it, choosing to protect rather than to hunt, to watch rather than to engage. There are obvious differences. Jura has made an active choice where Gehrman's situation is more passive, but the shape of a man who has outlived the clean moral certainty of his original purpose is similar. The hunters Gehrman made and lost are also, in some sense, every player who has come through the dream and received his equipping. Every person who downloaded Bloodborne and started a new game and found the old man in the wheelchair, waiting, ready to help. He is still doing his job. He is still preparing hunters. The scale of what the dream has processed in the game's own logic and in the meta-reality of how many people have played Bloodborne is staggering. He has been helping hunters for a very long time. What does he feel when a new hunter arrives? The game gives us a few windows into this. He is attentive, or as attentive as his condition allows. He offers useful information. He expresses genuine concern about the nature of the night and what the hunter is about to face. There is something in his attention to new arrivals that suggests the work has not yet become entirely rote for him, that each new hunter still registers as a specific individual who is about to face real danger and who deserves real preparation. But there is also the confusion, the blurring of one hunter into the next that his centuries of accumulated experience has produced. He calls people by the wrong names or by no names at all. He speaks of things that clearly relate to hunters he has known in the past, as if those past events might be present concerns. His relationship to time in the dream is, by all evidence, not quite linear in the way that ordinary consciousness experiences time. The past and the present bleed into each other. This means, in some sense, that the hunters he has lost are never quite gone from him. They persist in the dream's strange suspension of ordinary temporal logic, accessible to him as recent memories, even when they are actually ancient history. Maria is still recent to him in some sense that, ordinary grief does not capture. The students from the early workshop are still, in some corner of his mind, just recently having left. The losses are preserved alongside the presences, never quite resolved. The hunters he made and lost made him in turn. Each loss shaped what he has become. The cumulative weight of all those departures and all those silences, where the hunter's return should have been, is part of what fills the wheelchair, part of what makes the mumbling, part of what has gradually transformed the craftsman who built the tools into the guardian who can no longer wield them. He made hunters. They made him into what he is, and he is still there, still ready, still preparing the next one. Chapter 6. What the doll knows. The doll is not Maria. She will tell you this herself, in her gentle way, if you ask her about it. She knows what she is and what she isn't, and she seems to have arrived at a place of acceptance about her own nature that is remarkable given the circumstances of her creation. She was made by a grieving man to resemble a dead woman, and she exists in a dream that operates as a prison, and she has presumably been present for the entire long span of Gehrman's captivity, and she is kind. These facts together tell you a great deal about both of them. What does the doll know about Gehrman? More than anyone else in the game, certainly. She has been there, not just for the period the game covers, but for the whole of his captivity in the dream. She has seen him at his worst and at his better moments. She has heard whatever he has said in the long, quiet hours when no hunter is present, and it is just the two of them in the garden. She has watched him deteriorate, if deteriorate is the right word, has watched the centuries work on him in whatever way the dream's strange physics allows aging to work. The doll's dialogue contains certain moments that are quietly devastating if you read them carefully. When she talks about being glad to see you, about caring for the hunters who come through, there is something in her manner that suggests this is not a formula, but a genuine orientation. She has developed, in the centuries of the dream, something that functions like care, like actual concern for the well-being of the people she encounters. Whether this is something Gehrman built into her intentionally or something that emerged from her own existence in the dream is not fully clear. She knows what Gehrman suffers. This is the most important thing she knows. She cannot fix it, and she doesn't pretend to be able to fix it, but she sees it clearly. The old man in the wheelchair is not opaque to her the way he might be to a passing hunter. She has had centuries to learn the specific texture of his damage, to understand which of his silences are the silences of genuine focus and which are the silences of absence, which of his moments of warmth are genuine and which are the warmth of memory rather than present feeling. The specific tragedy of the doll's position is that she can provide company but not resolution. She can be present with Gehrman in his prison without being able to change the fact that it is a prison. She can care about him without being able to give him the one thing he actually needs, which is freedom. Her presence makes his captivity more survivable without making it less captive. She is, in this sense, a kind of extremely compassionate cruelty, something that is good in itself, but that exists in service of a system that is not good. Does she resent this? The game doesn't present her as resentful. She seems to genuinely accept her situation with something that looks like peace. But peace is not the same as contentment, and contentment is not the same as not understanding the situation. The doll, by all available evidence, understands her situation quite clearly. She knows she was made in Maria's likeness. She knows Gehrman made her because Maria died. She knows she is not Maria. She knows Gehrman is imprisoned. She knows she cannot free him. She knows all of this, and still she tends the dream with genuine care. There is something in this that is almost unbearably moving. She did not choose to be created. She did not choose the circumstances of her creation. She did not choose the role she occupies in the dream. But she has taken the existence she was given, with all its complications and constraints and fundamental sadness, and she has tried to make it as good as she can. This is not a passive acceptance, it is an active orientation toward doing what she can with what she has. What she cannot give Gehrman is what he most needs, which is the ability to stop. He cannot die in any ordinary sense within the dream. He cannot retire or choose not to continue. The moon presence's arrangement has made him permanent in a way that normal human existence is not, and the doll, despite her genuine concern for him, has no access to the mechanism that keeps him there. She can sit with him, she can talk with him, she can be kind to him, but she cannot open the gate. The relationship between Gehrman and the doll over the centuries of the dream must have had its own evolution, its own particular texture that changed as both of them changed in whatever ways the dream allowed them to change. In the early period, his grief for Maria would have been acute, and the doll's resemblance to Maria would have been both comfort and wound. Later, as the acute grief became chronic and the centuries accumulated, the dynamic between them might have shifted. She might have become, in whatever sense is available within the dream, simply his companion, distinct from Maria in his mind, even if not in his face. The doll treats the hunters with a warmth that mirrors the warmth Gehrman presumably showed his students in the before. This is one of the ways she's most clearly made in his image, not Maria's image, but Gehrman's. She was built by him, and what she embodies is not only what Maria looked like, but what Gehrman valued: kindness toward people who are in danger, care without condescension, presence without intrusiveness. These are things he apparently believed in before the dream took him, and they are preserved in her. When you as the player speak to the doll frequently and treat her with respect, she eventually says something that functions as one of the game's most explicit emotional moments. She talks about feelings and about not being certain what to do with them, about the experience of caring about someone in a context where the caring cannot be fully expressed or fully acted upon. This is not a description of her situation alone. It is a description of Gehrman's situation. It is a description of everyone in the dream who loves or cares for someone without being able to fully bridge the gap between feeling and action. The doll knows this. She knows because she's been living it for as long as she has existed. She knows what it is to have feelings that cannot be completed, to care about someone in a space that prevents the fullest expression of that care. She knows it because Gehrman built her into a situation that was already defined by exactly that kind of truncated love. He loved Maria after Maria was gone. He made the doll to fill the space that Maria had left. And the doll, who is the result of that act, lives the consequences of it every day. What she knows about Gehrman is ultimately what she knows about the specific shape of a grief that has become a way of existing in the world. She knows what it looks like when someone has stopped fighting their loss and started incorporating it. She knows what it sounds like when the wounds are so old they have become the baseline rather than the exception. She knows what it means to sit next to someone who is suffering and to be unable to do anything about the suffering except to be present. And she is present. That is what she offers. That is what she has offered for centuries. The constancy of her presence in a space where nothing else is constant, where hunters come and go, and Gehrman changes above them, and the moon presence moves through its alien purposes. She is there. She has always been there. She will be there after the events of the game, in whatever form the dream continues. The doll knows what Gehrman knows, and more. She knows things about him that he may not fully know about himself, patterns and habits and the specific ways he has aged in the dream that are visible from the outside and invisible to the person living them. She has watched him. She has paid attention. Over centuries she has accumulated a knowledge of one person that is deeper than any relationship in the game, including the one that inspired her creation. She is not Maria. She is something else entirely, a person who grew out of grief and became something real. And what she knows is that Gehrman is still there, still suffering, still trying, and still, in his worn and fragmented way, still worth caring about. That knowledge is what she holds. It is what she has always held. And she holds it the way she holds everything, with a gentleness that the dream does not deserve, and that he, despite everything, still does. Chapter 7. The night. He asks you to end it. The moment Gehrman asks you to let him free you is one of the most carefully constructed moments in the game. It comes at the end, after everything else, after you have fought through Gehrman and faced its most terrible things, and come finally to the garden where the old man waits. He has been there from the beginning. He will be there at the end. And at the end, he does something unexpected. He offers you a way out. The offer is framed as a mercy. He wants to free you from the dream. He wants to give you what the dream cannot give itself, an ending. He explains it with what sounds like genuine concern for your welfare, the concern of a teacher who's been watching you go through something difficult and wants to help you reach the other side of it. And underneath all of that, barely spoken but completely present, is the other thing he wants, for you to free him. He cannot ask you directly. This is a crucial detail. He cannot simply say, "I have been here for centuries, and I am exhausted, and I need someone to end this for me, and you are the one person who has come through the dream with enough capacity to actually do it." He cannot say this because to say it would be to fully acknowledge his situation in a way that the dream's logic, or his own psychological survival, may not permit. So he frames it as a gift to you. He offers you the ending, and he waits. The ending he offers, which is the first ending of the game, sees your character kneel before him. He takes his scythe and he uses it. And in the aftermath, your character wakes up in Gehrman, apparently having escaped the dream. The hunt is over. You are free. And Gehrman, presumably, returns to his chair in the empty garden and continues to wait for whatever comes next. This ending is devastating precisely because it looks like a resolution. You get out. The night is done. There is morning and the sound of birds and something that feels like peace. But the camera pulls back on the garden, and the doll is there, and Gehrman is there, and the dream continues. He helped you out. He did not get to leave with you. Whatever moment of feeling he experienced when the scythe fell, whatever relief or release or connection with another person that final act gave him, it was temporary. The dream did not end for him. He asked you to let him free you, but the words were in the wrong order. What he was really asking was for you to free him. And if you accept his offer, you do free him, but not in the way he needed. You free yourself, and he remains. The mercy he offered came at his own expense, which is entirely consistent with who he has always been, someone who orients toward others' well-being even when his own situation is desperate. The alternative, the path that leads to the game's second and third endings, requires you to refuse him. This is not as simple as it sounds. Refusing Gehrman means fighting him, and fighting Gehrman means fighting the most accomplished hunter in the history of the game's world. He rises from his wheelchair, and he is, despite everything, extraordinary. The centuries have not taken that from him. Whatever the dream has done to his mind and his spirit, his body in the dream is still capable of the thing he built his life around. This is one of the most emotionally complex boss fights in Bloodborne, because Gehrman is not an enemy in any meaningful sense. He is a man who is trying to fulfill his role in the dream by giving you the ending the dream provides. He is also, simultaneously, a man who is fighting you with everything he has, because he is still, underneath everything, a hunter. And hunters don't simply lie down. He is doing his job, and he is also, somewhere in there, dying to be beaten. He wants you to win. He needs you to win. He cannot let you win without making you earn it. The things he says during the fight contain the whole of his tragedy in condensed form. He calls you a good hunter. He tells you to fear the blood. He speaks of the scourge with the knowledge of someone who has watched it for a very long time. And he fights with the skill and the ferocity of the person he was before the dream got hold of him, as if the fight itself is temporarily restoring something that the centuries of captivity had suppressed. When you win, when Gehrman is defeated, The moon presence arrives. It was always going to arrive. This is what the dream was for. This is the moment the moon presence arranged the entire apparatus to produce. Gehrman, in his role as warden, was meant to prevent exactly this outcome, and he has failed. Or succeeded, depending on which side of the fight you're looking from. The moon presence, confronted directly, is the third boss of this sequence, and the final obstacle between most players and the game's second ending. Defeating it produces an ending where you become the new master of the dream, which is another way of saying you take Gehrman's place. This is not generally read as a happy ending, which makes sense because it isn't one. The third ending, the true ending, or something closer to it, requires the umbilical cord items and produces an ascension rather than a succession. You don't become the warden, you go somewhere else entirely. But this too is downstream of what was done to Gehrman, downstream of the moon presence's arrangement and the long centuries of the dream, and it requires understanding all of that to fully understand what the third ending's transformation means. But let's stay with Gehrman because this is his story. What happens to him in the endings that aren't the first one? In the second ending, after the moon presence is defeated, Gehrman is shown in the garden. He is no longer in his wheelchair. He is lying in the flowers, which could be read as death or as sleep, or as simply a different kind of stillness than the one the wheelchair represented. The dream continues in some form, but its warden has changed. Whether Gehrman has been freed by the moon presence's defeat, or whether he has simply been superseded, is one of the game's deliberate ambiguities. The reading that makes the most sense emotionally is that his defeat in the boss fight, his inability to perform the function the moon presence required of him, released him from the obligation in some way. He fought, he was overcome. The arrangement he was kept in place to maintain has been disrupted by someone powerful enough to disrupt it. Whatever comes next, the endless waiting is done. If that's true, if his defeat in the boss fight is the thing that finally ends his captivity, then the fight is both the worst thing that happens to him and the best thing. He is beaten. He is relieved of his post. He can stop. He can finally, after centuries, stop. The night he asks you to end it is the night the whole game has been building toward. Not in the sense of action or plot mechanics, though those are present, in the sense of emotional destination. Gehrman's story begins with a man who believed the hunt was worth the cost, and it ends with a man who has paid the cost so completely that the only thing he wants is to stop paying. He asks for ending in the only way he can frame it as acceptable. He offers you a gift, he makes it about you, and you, if you understand what he's really asking, have to decide what kind of answer to give. Chapter 8. What his tragedy means. There is a version of Gehrman's story that resolves into a lesson, something clean and extractable, a moral about attachment, or about the cost of building institutions, or about what happens when great beings take an interest in ordinary human lives. Bloodborne resists this version pretty consistently, and Gehrman's story is no exception. What his tragedy means is not something you can hold at arm's length and examine as a principle. It requires staying close to the specific, to the workshop and the weapons and the face he put on the doll and the scythe he carries in the dream, and the way he calls you student without quite being able to place you as an individual. That said, there are things his tragedy illuminates that are worth naming. The first is the particular danger of building things that outlast your ability to control them. Gehrman built the hunt as a tool for protecting Gehrman. The hunt became an institution that served many purposes, not all of them protective, and eventually became something that enabled atrocities, like what happened in the fishing hamlet. He could not control this. He was not responsible for the specific decisions that took the hunt in those directions. But he built the foundation on which those decisions were made, and the tools with which they were carried out. This is not a reason to not build things. It is a reason to think carefully about what you build and to hold lightly to the belief that you can fully predict how it will be used. Gehrman's tragedy is not that he built the workshop. It's that he built it in a world that was larger and more complex and more capable of corruption than his understanding of it allowed for. The workshop was good. What the world did with it was not entirely in his hands. The second thing his tragedy illuminates is the specific cruelty of grief without resolution. The doll was not enough. The garden was not enough. The continued work of preparing hunters was not enough. Nothing in the dream was sufficient to process the loss of Maria in a way that allowed Gehrman to move forward. This is partly because the dream is not a place where moving forward is possible in the full sense, but it is also because some losses are simply not processable in ordinary terms. They change the shape of the person who suffers them, and the changed shape is permanent. Gehrman with Maria was one kind of person. Gehrman without Maria in the dream is another kind of person. The second is not a recovered version of the first. He is the version that exists after something was removed that could not be replaced. He made the doll to fill the space, and the doll is wonderful, and the space is still there. The third thing is something about the nature of service and whether service chosen from within a cage is really service at all. Gehrman continues to help hunters. He continues to do the work, but he does it as a prisoner, not as a free person who has decided that this is how to use his freedom. The work is the same work, but it is not the same thing. Service given freely and service given from captivity look identical from the outside, but feel completely different from the inside. Gehrman has been giving what looks like service for centuries, and it has not made him whole, because it was never quite truly his to give. The fourth, and maybe the most uncomfortable thing, is about what it means to trap someone in their own purpose. The moon presence did not take Gehrman away from his life and put him to work on something alien. It took him and the thing he cared most about and arranged them together in a permanent installation. He is the first hunter, permanently enshrined in the dream that is the staging ground for all subsequent hunting. He is doing, in some sense, what he was built to do, and it is destroying him. This is the most insidious version of captivity, the kind that uses your own nature against you. It is harder to resist a cage that is shaped exactly like you, harder to fight for freedom when what you're being kept in place to do is the thing you would have chosen to do freely. Gehrman cannot say that the moon presence has bent him towards something alien. He can only say that it has taken what was his and made it not his anymore. The hunt was his work. Now it is his obligation. The difference matters enormously. These things are what Gehrman's tragedy illuminates, but they are not what his tragedy means in the full sense. His tragedy means something that happens at the level of feeling rather than the level of argument. It means the specific feeling of understanding, as you play through Bloodborne, that the old man in the wheelchair has been there the entire time, has been suffering the entire time, has been trying to help you even as he himself needs help. It means the feeling of having been helped by someone who couldn't help himself. FromSoft does not often give you clean emotional catharsis. They give you weight, they give you complexity, they give you situations that don't resolve, and characters who don't recover, and endings that are not quite happy even when they are the best available option. Gehrman is perhaps the most complete instance of this approach, the character who carries the most weight, and who is treated with the most care, and who is given the most dignity in his suffering. He is not used as a symbol of something larger. He is allowed to be specifically himself, the first hunter, the maker of tools, the teacher of Maria, the man in the garden, the prisoner who tends his prison and calls it home because the alternative is to be overwhelmed by the difference between what he has and what he once was. His tragedy means Bloodborne understands something true about how people survive things that should destroy them. Not by overcoming the loss, not by processing the grief into wisdom and moving on, by continuing, by getting up in whatever way is available, by being still present when someone new arrives still able to offer something, still oriented, however incompletely, toward the well-being of others. Gehrman is still trying, after everything, after Maria and the dream and the moon presence and the centuries. He is still in the workshop, still ready to help the next hunter, still attempting, in his worn and fragmented way, to do the thing he built his life around doing. That is what his tragedy means, not that loss destroys, not that grief is always terminal, but that a person can survive the unsurvivable and remain, in some essential way, recognizable, reduced, damaged beyond ordinary repair, but recognizable, still him, the man who built the tools and taught the hunters and loved Maria and made the doll and sat in the garden for centuries, is still in the figure who meets you at the end of the night, present. Buried, yes, worn down to something much smaller than he once was, but still there. And when you finally face him, whether you accept his offer or refuse it, what you are facing is not simply a boss encounter or a final obstacle. You are facing the oldest person in the story, the one who was there before the dream and will be there in some form after its current arrangement is disrupted, the one who paid every possible cost the hunt could extract and kept paying after the reasonable limit of payment had been reached. Gehrman, first hunter, last standing, still, against all evidence that it makes any difference, still trying. Chapter 9. The scythe he carries. There is something that needs to be said about the weapon Gehrman carries in the dream, because it is not incidental. The old hunter's bone and the burial blade, that massive trick weapon that unfolds from something compact into something enormous, is not a weapon he made for utility. It is a weapon he made for himself, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference is legible in the design if you know how to look. The other weapons in the dream workshop, the cleaver, the axe, the cane, these are tools made for hunters in general. They represent his thinking about what hunters as a class would need. The burial blade is different. It is personal. It is shaped around a specific body and a specific fighting style, around his body and his style, and it is a scythe, which is not a conventional weapon in any tradition that prioritizes survival over symbolism. Nobody chooses a scythe because it is optimal. You choose a scythe because it means something to you, because the form of it, the long handle and the curved blade, and the motion it requires, that sweeping arc, speaks to something about how you understand your own work. Gehrman, who designed weapons with purpose in mind, did not design his weapon with the detached pragmatism he applied to the others. He designed it with an awareness of what he was. A scythe is a harvesting tool. It gathers what has grown until its time is done and cuts it. It moves through living things and leaves them changed. This is, with uncomfortable clarity, a description of what Gehrman has done for centuries. He has harvested hunters. Not in a malicious way, not with cruelty, but he has been the mechanism through which hunters are prepared and sent out, and sometimes not returned, through which the hunt claims what it claims. He built the institution that harvests, and his personal weapon is a scythe. Whether this symbolism was intentional on his part when he first made the weapon, before the dream, before the full weight of what he was building had made itself clear, is not something the game resolves. He may have made it for purely aesthetic or functional reasons that only acquired symbolic weight in retrospect. He may have understood, even then, something about what the hunt was and what his role in it would be. Both readings are consistent with the evidence. What is certain is that when you fight him at the end, he uses it with complete mastery. The burial blade in his hands is not the weapon of a man who has forgotten what he is. It is the weapon of someone who has spent an incomprehensible amount of time becoming so thoroughly himself that the centuries have refined rather than diminished his ability. He is slower than he was, probably. He is carried differently than a young man carries himself. But the scythe moves through the dream garden with a precision that was not learned in the dream. It was built over decades of actual use, in the actual world, before the dream was even a concept. This is one of the stranger aspects of Gehrman's captivity. It preserved the craft along with the craftsman. He cannot age out of ability in the dream, the way a human body ages out of physical capacity in the real world. Whatever the dream's physics do to the ordinary processes of decline, they have left him the thing he built himself to be. The wheelchair is real, and the damage is real, and the exhaustion is real, but so is the hunter. Both are true at the same time. He is simultaneously broken and extraordinary, and the fight at the end of the game is the most complete expression of that paradox the game offers. The burial blade has a description, as all weapons in Bloodborne do, and the description is worth sitting with. It refers to it as a trick weapon of the workshop, the very first of its kind, and notes that Gehrman is said to have been a hunter of the highest order, said to have been. Not is. The past tense is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The weapon was made by someone who was something. The person who made it is not fully that person anymore. But the weapon is still the weapon. It still works. And when Gehrman stands up from the wheelchair and takes it in his hands, there is a moment where the past tense dissolves and he is briefly, fully, the person he said to have been. That moment, the moment before the fight begins in earnest, when he is standing and the weapon is in his hands and he is looking at you, is one of the most carefully constructed images in the game. He is old, he is damaged, he is exhausted in ways that no amount of rest in the dream has been able to address, and he is also magnificent. He is the first hunter at the end of his endurance, finally being given permission to act. The scythe he carries is the story of who he is told in steel and handle and blade geometry. It is a harvesting tool held by a man who understands himself as something other than a simple protector. He protects, yes, he has always protected, but he knows what the hunt costs, what it takes, what it requires of everyone who participates in it. He built the instrument that made the taking possible. He has carried that knowledge in the form of a curved blade for longer than anyone else alive. When the fight is over and he is lying in the flowers, the weapon is still there. The dream continues to produce it for hunters who want to learn from it, who want to fight the way Gehrman fought. This is his legacy in its most direct form, not the institution, not the philosophy, not the stories the hunters tell, but the weapon itself, still available, still usable, still carrying the logic of its maker in every dimension of its design. He made a scythe. He knew what it meant to make a scythe. He carried it for centuries as the warden of the hunt staging ground, and when the time came to use it for the last time, he used it perfectly. That is who he was. Underneath everything else, that is who he never stopped being. Chapter 10. What he remembers. One of the questions the game raises without quite answering is what Gehrman's experience of memory is like after centuries in the dream. Memory in ordinary human experience is a managed archive, constantly revised, constantly losing fidelity, constantly reorganized by time and need, and the simple fact that the brain cannot hold everything at full resolution forever. Things fade. The sharp details of a face or a conversation become approximate over time. The feeling of a moment lasts longer than the specifics of it, and eventually the feeling too softens and generalizes until it is less a particular memory and more a sense of having once felt something in that direction. Gehrman has been in the dream too long for ordinary memory science to apply. The dream is not an ordinary environment, and whatever it does to time and to the processes that normally govern consciousness, it does not seem to do the same thing to memory that ordinary time does. He remembers things with what appears to be unusual vividness for events that must, by any external reckoning, be centuries old. He speaks of the early hunt, of the workshop, of Maria, with an immediacy that suggests these things are present to him in a way that should not be possible given the elapsed time. This is part of what makes his condition so particular. He cannot forget. The dream has preserved not just his body, but his memories. And the preservation is not the gentle softening of normal remembering. It is something closer to the preservation of a specimen, things held in suspension, accessible at full intensity, never quite allowed to become the past in the way that would make them bearable. Grief in ordinary human experience is terrible in the short term, and then gradually, over years, becomes different. Not absent, not resolved, but metabolized. The body learns to carry it differently. The memories of the lost person become tinged with something other than pure loss. The good memories become possible to access without being immediately accompanied by the full weight of the loss. This is not forgetting. It is the ordinary processing that time and life and continued experience make possible. Gehrman has not had this. The dream does not seem to allow it. Maria is as recent to him as she ever was in some important sense. Not in the sense that he thinks she just died, but in the sense that the memory of her has not been able to metabolize into something different through the normal operations of time. She is still the wound she was when the wound was fresh. The centuries have not healed it. They have only made the person carrying it more tired. What does he remember of her specifically? The game gives us some access to this through the doll, who is the physical residue of his memory of Maria. He remembered her face well enough to recreate it. He remembered her posture, her proportions, the quality of her presence well enough to build something that carries her physical echo. This is not a vague recollection. This is the memory of someone who looked at Maria with the kind of attention that encodes a person in detail. He also remembers her name. This sounds obvious until you consider how many hunters he has known and cannot reliably name. How many people have passed through the dream and become, in his deteriorated perception of individual identity, simply the category of hunter rather than a specific person. Maria has not suffered this fate. Her name is still on his tongue in a way that suggests it has never left. She is not one of many. She is still, after everything, the specific one. What else does he remember? The original workshop, the physical space of it, well enough that the dream workshop is modelled on it in what appears to be exact detail. The early hunters, or at least the feeling of the early hunters, the sense of what that period was like before the dream and before the worst of what the hunt became. He remembers what it felt like to believe the hunt was something that could be managed, which is one of the cruelest things for a memory to preserve. The feeling of a confidence that subsequent events have demonstrated was unfounded. He may remember his life before the hunt, childhood, if he had an ordinary childhood, though what ordinary would have meant in Gehrman at that period is its own complicated question. The people who came before the hunt, the people who were part of whatever life he had before the workshop, and the weapons, and the founding of the institution. These memories, if they survive, would be the oldest and therefore in any ordinary reckoning the most faded, but in the dream they may be as accessible as everything else. There is something unbearable in the idea of a person who can remember everything, who cannot allow anything to fade into the softer past where it would be survivable. Every hunter who didn't come back is still a recent loss in some sense, that ordinary grief would have resolved into history. Every moment of the early period when things still made sense is still accessible, with the specificity that would normally diminish into generality. The dream keeps everything fresh, which means everything that would have eventually been survivable remains at the pitch of its worst acuity, he mumbles. This is one of the things the game tells you about him through his dialogue patterns. His sentences don't always complete. He begins thoughts and lets them trail. He addresses people who aren't there, or who were once there and aren't anymore, or who might be there and might not be, the distinction having become unclear. This is what happens to a person who is carrying too many memories at too high a resolution for too long. The signal-to-noise ratio degrades. Too much is present simultaneously. The architecture of coherent thought starts to have structural problems under the weight. And yet, when something matters enough, he is coherent. He is coherent about the weapons. He is coherent about Maria in his way, even if that coherence is painful to witness. He is coherent about the danger of the night, and the cost of the hunt, and the things a hunter needs to know to survive. The things that were built deepest in him, the things that were most essentially his before the dream took him, these survived the degradation of everything else. He is a man whose peripheral functions have been damaged by time, while his core remains, reduced but intact. What he remembers is, in the end, what he is. The memories he has carried for centuries are the substance of his identity at this point, more than anything the dream has added. He is the sum of a life he can no longer fully live, preserved in vivid and slightly distorted detail, carrying the dead and the lost and the early mornings of a world that no longer exists, with an intimacy that nothing about his current situation can diminish. He cannot forget Maria. He cannot forget the workshop, or the hunters, or the cost of what he built. He cannot forget what it felt like to believe things were manageable. And he cannot forget the specific moment, whenever it was, when he understood they were not. He carries all of it. He has always carried all of it. The dream gave him the infinite time to do so, and no mechanism by which to set any of it down. This is what it means to say the dream is a prison. Not just that he cannot leave the garden, it is that he cannot leave any of it. He is enclosed on every side by what he remembers, as much as by any physical boundary the moon presence constructed. The garden has walls, but the memories have no walls at all. They go as far as he does, in every direction, for as far as he can see. Chapter 11. The Other Hunters Who Became Legends. Bloodborne's world did not stop producing remarkable people after Gehrman was taken into the dream. This is one of the things that makes his isolation so complete, that the world continued to generate exactly the kind of person he had built his life around cultivating, and he could only encounter them filtered through the dream's strange intermediary space, never in the full reality of the waking world where he had known Maria and the early hunters. Some of these later hunters became legends in their own right. The powder kegs, the splinter faction of the workshop tradition that embraced heavy trick weapons and a philosophy of brute confrontation rather than adaptive finesse, are descendants of what Gehrman built, even if their approach would not have entirely satisfied him. They took his core insight that hunters needed specialized tools and pushed it in a direction that prioritized spectacle alongside effectiveness. There is something recognizably his in what they did, and something that has departed from his original intention, which is the fate of most institutional legacies. The old hunters encountered in the DLC represent what the institution produced at its extreme. People like Ludwig, who became something both more and less than human in the service of the hunt, who took the church's augmented approach to hunting and pushed it past any boundary Gehrman had conceived of. Ludwig's transformation is downstream of decisions the healing church made with tools and knowledge that trace back, however indirectly, to the institutional foundation Gehrman laid. He built an institution that was eventually capable of producing Ludwig, which is not an accusation but a fact, the kind of fact that a founder has to live with when they have built something larger than their ability to control it. Simon the Harrowed is perhaps the most direct echo of Gehrman's original ethical framework, available in the DLC. He is someone who approached the hunt with genuine moral seriousness, who found himself disturbed by what the hunt had become and what it required, and who chose to investigate rather than simply continue. He is not a pure product of Gehrman's tradition, but he embodies the kind of questioning that Gehrman, in his best period, would have recognized as the behavior of a real hunter rather than a mere weapon. Maria's ethical crisis and Simon's ethical alertness are connected in spirit, even if not in direct lineage. Gascoigne, the hunter the game uses as its first major test of the player's competence, is a later figure entirely, someone who has been consumed by exactly the process Gehrman built his institution to manage. He went too deep, the blood took him, and the man who was a hunter became the beast that hunters are supposed to kill. Gehrman has presumably processed hunters like Gascoigne for as long as the hunt has been running. He has equipped people who would eventually succumb to the very thing they were fighting. He has sent them out knowing that some of them would not come back as themselves. What does he make of this pattern? The game does not give us direct access to his thoughts on the hunters who turn, but the pattern is so pervasive in Gehrman's history that anyone who has been managing the dream for centuries could not have failed to notice it. There is a futility in the hunt that the hunt itself seems designed to obscure, a futility that anyone paying close enough attention for long enough would eventually have to confront. The hunters are protecting a city that is also producing the thing that requires protection. The blood that enables the hunters also threatens to consume them. The whole apparatus is, from a certain altitude, a machine for producing its own problem. Gehrman built part of the machine. He built the hunting part of it, not the blood part, not the church's ambition and its reckless experimentation. But the hunting part cannot be neatly separated from the rest. It participates in the same system. It sustains the same arrangement. And the arrangement is, ultimately, not working in any direction that points toward resolution. The hunters who became legends after Gehrman's captivity began are people he knows about, if he knows about them at all, only through the distorted lens of the dream. He sees them as the dream presents them, people who come to prepare and people who do not return. He equips them with the same tools and sends them out into the same night. He cannot fully know what they become, cannot witness the full shape of their stories, because the dream is not the world. This is another dimension of his isolation. Not only does he not have full access to the real world, he does not have full access to the stories of the people who pass through his space. He sees them at their beginning, equipped and ready, and he sees the ones who return diminished or changed. The full arcs of their lives and their hunting and their eventual fates are things he can only partially reconstruct from the fragments the dream provides. He has helped shape the context in which all of these legends became what they became, without being able to witness most of it. He is the unseen foundation that made the visible structure possible. And the visible structure has produced things both glorious and terrible that he has not fully seen and could not have fully predicted. The other hunters who became legends are, in a sense, both his legacy and his estrangement from it. They are what the institution he built produced at its furthest reach. They are proof that he built something that lasted and mattered and generated remarkable people long after he was removed from active participation in it, and they are a reminder of everything he has missed, of the full and complicated history of the hunt that continued to unfold while he tended the garden. He made the tools, the legends used them. The distance between those two facts is the distance of his captivity, measured in the only units that really matter, which are not years but the specific texture of human experience that he has been unable to access for a very long time. Chapter 12. If he could have left. There is a question the game raises implicitly but never answers, which is what Gehrman would have done if the moon presence had released him at some point during the centuries of his captivity. Not at the end, not in the context of the player's arrival and the events that follow, but earlier. In the middle of it, if the gate had simply opened one day and he had been free to walk out, back into whatever remained of the world, what would he have done? This is not a question the game is set up to answer, and the answer is probably more complicated than it initially appears to be. The obvious answer is that he would have left. He would have gone back to whatever he could find of the waking world, processed his grief in some more ordinary way, and either continued to contribute to the hunt from the outside, or retired from it entirely and lived out whatever remained of a natural human life? This is the obvious answer, and it is probably partly true. He would have left. But the question of what he would have done after leaving is harder, because by the time any mid-captivity release would have been possible, he would already have been in the dream long enough to have been significantly changed by it. Not as changed as he is by the time the game begins, but changed. The dream's particular qualities, the fixity, the absence of genuine time's passage, the accumulated experience of too many hunters and too much repetition, would already have begun to work on him. A person who has been in the dream for 50 years is not the same person who went in. A person who has been there for 100 years is less recognizably the same. By 200 years, the changes would be so thorough that the question of whether it is still the same person in any meaningful sense is genuinely open. Gehrman at the dream's beginning and Gehrman at the game's end are connected by continuous identity, but divided by a gulf of experience and change that strains the ordinary concept of being the same person. So the question of what he would have done if released is also a question of when the release would have happened, and the answer changes depending on the when. An early Gehrman, still relatively intact, would have been able to return to something like ordinary life. A middle Gehrman, already bearing the particular damage of the dream, would have found the world outside strange and difficult to navigate. A late Gehrman, the one we actually encounter, would have found freedom almost incomprehensible. This is one of the more disturbing aspects of the Moon Presence's arrangement. It is self-reinforcing in a specific way. The longer Gehrman is in the dream, the less able he would be to function outside it, which means the longer he is kept there, the more completely he is made into someone who can only exist there. By the time he could theoretically be released, the concept of release has become largely theoretical, because the person who would be released is no longer fully equipped to inhabit the freedom he would be given. Would he have gone back to Maria? No, because Maria was already dead before the dream began. But he might have gone back to her grave, or to the places where she had been, or to the fishing hamlet that she could not survive having participated in. He might have tried to make some kind of peace with what happened there, with his role in training her for the thing that broke her. Or he might have found that impossible, that the grief was still too acute, even with the world's full resources available for processing it. He might have gone back to the original workshop in Old Gehrman if it survived in any form he could recognize. He might have tried to reassert some kind of connection with the institution he built, to understand what it had become in his absence, to find out whether any trace of his original intention had survived the decades or centuries of the church's management. He might have found that depressing enough to constitute its own crisis. He might, if the release had come late enough and the world had deteriorated far enough, have found nothing recognizable to return to. Gehrman at the time of the game's events is not Gehrman at the time of the original workshop. The city has become something specific to itself, a place where the hunt and the plague and the church's experiments and the blood's true nature have all reached a kind of fever pitch. There is not much of the early city left, even in physical terms. What this means is that the freedom Gehrman asked for, when he asked you to let him free you, was not entirely a freedom to return to something. It was primarily a freedom to stop, to not continue, to reach the ending that should have come for him at some natural point in a natural life. He was not asking to be released into a world he could inhabit. He was asking to be released from the one he could no longer survive in good faith. This is another way his situation is different from simple imprisonment. A prisoner imagines freedom as access to things they have been denied. Gehrman's imagined freedom has become something more basic than access to anything. It is the freedom to not be present anymore, to not be required to continue. The world outside the dream would be wonderful, yes, but what he actually needs is simply the end of the obligation to keep going. If he could have left, he would have gone. But where he would have gone was always secondary to the fact of being allowed to go at all. The destination mattered less than the departure. The specific content of freedom mattered less than the mere reality of it. He could not leave. The gate stayed closed, and the man who would have walked through it, if it had opened, became, over the centuries, less and less recognizable as the man who first stood at the threshold. That is the final cruelty of it. Not that he was kept in the dream, but that the keeping itself made him into someone for whom the outside had become largely hypothetical. He was trapped, and the trap did its work so thoroughly that by the end he no longer fully knew what he was trapped away from. The garden remained, the flowers bloomed, the workshop held its tools, and Gehrman sat in his chair and waited for something he could no longer quite name, in a freedom he could no longer quite imagine, that he still, against all evidence, needed more than anything else the dream could offer. Chapter 13. The Morning After. Bloodborne ends in the morning. All three of its major endings involve, in some way, the coming of light after the long night. The sun rises over Gehrman, or something that functions like sunrise, and the dream resolves into whatever it resolves into, and the player character either wakes in the city or ascends beyond it, or becomes something new entirely. The morning is not peaceful, exactly. It is not the morning of something resolved so much as the morning of something exhausted. But it is morning. Gehrman has been waiting for morning for a very long time. There is a particular feature of the first ending that deserves more attention than it usually gets. When your character accepts Gehrman's offer and he uses the burial blade, and you wake in Gehrman, there is a brief moment in the garden shown from the outside. The doll is there. She is doing something with a small creature, a small being that appears to be a new hunter, an infant of the dream in some sense. She is tending something small and new, and Gehrman is in his chair, but the posture is different. The long wait for someone capable of receiving what he offered has ended. He did the thing he had been holding himself in readiness to do, and now there is simply the garden and the doll, and whatever comes next. Does he feel relief? The game doesn't let us inside his head at that moment, which is consistent with its approach throughout. What we can say is that the first ending is the one most aligned with what Gehrman actually wanted, in the sense that it is the ending where he performs the function he has been waiting to perform. He frees a hunter. He provides the ending the dream was built to provide. Whatever the moon presence needs from this arrangement, it received it. And Gehrman, in the moment of providing it, was the person he was built to be. There is a version of this ending where it is not tragic at all, where Gehrman finally got to do the thing he had been suspended in readiness for, and the doing of it gave him something that looked like completion, where the long wait and the long suffering and the long tending of the workshop were not without purpose, because they produced this: one hunter freed, one ending given, one person who came through the dream and came out the other side into morning. The tragedy of this reading is that it requires accepting the moon presence's framing of what the dream was for. It requires looking at Gehrman's captivity and saying, yes, this was the point. This was worth it. The centuries of imprisonment produced a moment of genuine service, and service is what he was. It requires accepting that the moon presence, in its alien way, was right about what Gehrman was for. Most readings of the game refuse this. The first ending is generally considered the worst ending, or at least the most ambiguous one, precisely because accepting it requires accepting the moon presence's logic. But there is something in Gehrman's face, in the posture and the stillness of the garden in that final moment, that makes the full refusal complicated. He is not, in that moment, obviously suffering. He has done the thing. The thing is done. What comes after is unclear, but the moment itself has a quality of arrival that nothing else in the game quite offers. The second ending, where the moon presence is defeated and Gehrman lies in the flowers, is harder to read. He is no longer in the chair. The arrangement has been disrupted. Whatever kept him there has been overcome. He is lying down, which is either death or rest, or something the dream allows that ordinary waking doesn't, and the quality of it is ambiguous in a way that the game seems to intend. Is he freed? Is he simply collapsed? Is the absence of the moon presence the thing that finally allows him to stop? Or does stopping require something more active? The flowers around him in that shot are the same flowers that have always been in the garden. The garden has not changed. The doll is present, tending something. The dream continues in some form, but Gehrman is horizontal. And horizontal is different from the chair. Horizontal is something a person chooses when the obligation to remain upright has finally been lifted. There is a reading where lying in the flowers is the best possible version of what the dream can offer him. Not freedom in the full sense, not escape, not mourning in Gehrman or anywhere else, but rest, simply rest. The flowers are soft and the light is gentle, and the garden is quiet, and he does not have to tend the workshop, or equip the hunters, or sit in the chair waiting for the next one to arrive. He can just lie there. In the dream, which is still the dream, but without the specific weight of the obligation that has defined his existence for centuries. The morning after Gehrman's long night is not a triumphant thing. It is not a sunrise over a city reborn, or a clear sky after a storm. It is quieter and more uncertain and more appropriate to what he actually is, which is someone who was kept going past every reasonable limit and who simply, finally, stopped being required to continue. He earned that stopping. He did not earn it in the sense of having done everything right, because the story of Gehrman is not a story of doing things right. He made errors of judgment and errors of construction and errors of the heart, and the world made errors around him that exceeded anything he could have prevented. He earned the stopping simply by having been present for everything the dream required of him, and having continued to try, however imperfectly, however incompletely, however worn down by the trying. The morning after. It is not the morning he would have chosen in the before, when he had a workshop and students and a future he believed was manageable. It is the morning that was available to him, given everything that intervened between that future and this one. And it is, if you look at it honestly, still morning, still the end of the night, still the arrival of something that is not the night, still, even in its ambiguity and its sorrow, a change in the quality of the light. Gehrman waited for morning for centuries. The game offers him something that might be morning, in whatever form morning is possible, for someone who spent so long in the dream. It is not the morning he deserved, but it is morning nonetheless. And that, for someone who has been in the dark as long as he has, is not nothing. That is not nothing at all. You said, "Continue, continue, 1909, Claude responded. Chapter 14. What the Workshop Remembers. Chapter 14. What the Workshop Remembers. Objects hold memory differently than people do. A person's memory is active, revised, subject to the distortions of time and emotion, and the brain's constant rewriting of its own archive. An object simply is what it is. It does not revise. It does not soften the past or make it more bearable. It holds the exact shape of the moment it was made in, without editorial intervention, without the mercy of forgetting. The tools in the Hunter's Dream Workshop are this kind of memory. They remember Gehrman in a way Gehrman can no longer remember himself. The saw cleaver was one of the first. Its design reflects a specific moment in the early history of the hunt, a moment when the primary concern was practical, and the primary question was what kind of edge would be most effective against a body that was in the process of becoming something other than a body. The answer Gehrman arrived at, or contributed to arriving at, was something serrated, something that tore rather than simply cut, because tearing interrupted the beast's momentum in a way that a clean cut did not. This is a practical conclusion drawn from actual observation of actual beasts, which means it is a conclusion drawn from a period when Gehrman was still moving through the world, still gathering information from a direct experience, still updating his understanding of what the hunt required. The saw cleaver remembers that Gehrman, the problem solver, the person who looked at a crisis and asked what it actually needed rather than what the conventional response would be. The tool holds that version of him in its geometry, in the angle of the teeth and the mechanism of its transformation. You can hold the saw cleaver and know something about the man who thought it into existence that you cannot know from looking at the man in the wheelchair. The threaded cane is a different kind of memory. It is elegant in a way the saw cleaver is not, designed for a different kind of hunter and a different kind of encounter, for situations where precision and reach matter more than raw disrupting force. The cane speaks of a Gehrman who understood that the hunt required different people with different approaches, that there was no single correct way to be a hunter, and that the tools needed to reflect this. It speaks of generosity of vision, of an understanding of human variety that went beyond his own particular style and accommodated the styles of others. This is also, quietly, a kind of memory about Maria. The threaded cane is not Maria's weapon, she used the rakuyo, but the philosophy behind it is the philosophy of someone who made room for hunters who were different from himself, who understood that a student might need something other than what the teacher preferred, who valued the student's own nature enough to equip it rather than simply try to replicate himself. The cane remembers the Gehrman who is capable of that kind of seeing. The hunter axe is simpler than the others, more direct, less philosophically complex. It remembers the part of Gehrman that was simply effective, that understood there were moments where elegance was beside the point, and what was needed was weight and reach and the willingness to commit to the blow. Every craftsman, however sophisticated their general approach, has a version of the hammer in their toolkit. The hunter axe is Gehrman's hammer. It remembers that he was not only a thinker about the hunt, but a practitioner of it, someone who went out into the night and did the brutal physical work of what the hunt required. The workshop itself, apart from the specific tools, holds a different kind of memory. It is a memory of space, of the physical arrangement of a working place that was once actually worked in. The benches are the right height for someone of Gehrman's general build. The organisation of the tools reflects a particular logic of use and access. Things that are reached for most often are closest. Things that require more deliberate effort are further away. This is the memory of a body moving through a space habitually, of hands that knew where everything was without looking, of a person so thoroughly at home in a place that the place had begun to conform to them. In the dream, this spatial memory is preserved without the body that created it. Gehrman's hands are no longer reaching for the tools in the habitual way. He is in the chair, which is not at the bench. The workshop is arranged for a Gehrman who no longer occupies it in the active sense, preserved as testimony to someone who used to be there in a way that he no longer is. It is a home whose inhabitant has moved to a different room and is not coming back to this one. The doll moves through this space in a way that is careful and attentive. She is aware of what the workshop means, or she behaves as if she is aware of it, which for the purposes of the dream amounts to the same thing. She does not disturb it. She does not rearrange it according to her own preferences, if she has preferences of that kind. She maintains it as it was, as it has always been, as a record of someone who is still present in the garden, but no longer fully present in the workshop, in the way the workshop was designed to accommodate. There are hunters who come through the dream and pick up the tools and learn from them, in the sense of adding them to their arsenal and developing their own relationships with what Gehrman designed. For these hunters, the tools are not memory at all. They are equipment, they are means to an end. They take the saw cleaver or the hunter axe, and they make something new of it, something specific to themselves. And in doing so, they extend what Gehrman built without necessarily knowing they are extending it. This is how legacies actually work. Not through the continuous awareness of debt to the originator, but through the absorption of what someone built into the ongoing practice of people who may barely know the name of the person who built it. The hunters who pick up the saw cleaver and find that it suits them, who develop a style around its particular qualities, are Gehrman's legacy in the most direct sense. Not because they know this, because the tool shaped them in a direction he intended, and the shaping persisted regardless of whether the credit followed. What the workshop remembers, taken altogether, is someone who believed in preparation, who thought that readiness was a form of care, that equipping a person properly was an act of respect for them and for what they were about to face. The tools are not ostentatious, they are not designed to impress, they are designed to work, which is what a craftsman who actually cares about the person using the tool designs. A craftsman who cares only about the craft designs tools that demonstrate the craft. Gehrman designed tools that serve the user, which is a distinction that matters. He believed the people who would use these tools deserved the best version of what he could make. This belief is visible in every design choice, in the elegance of the transformation mechanisms, in the quality of the materials, in the thought given to how a body would actually move with this thing in its hands. He was trying to give them every possible advantage. He was trying, in the only language available to a craftsman, to tell them that he wanted them to survive. Most of them didn't, or they survived the physical danger and were consumed by something worse. The tools were not sufficient for everything the night required, but the intention was real, and the workshop holds it, and every hunter who picks up what he made receives it, however unknowingly. The workshop remembers Gehrman more faithfully than Gehrman can remember himself. It holds him at his best in the form of things that have lasted. The chair and the mumbling and the confusion are real too, but they are the residue of what was done to him. The tools are the residue of who he was before the doing, and they are still here, still offered, still carrying the intention of a man who wanted the people he couldn't protect to at least be well equipped. That is not a small thing to leave behind. In fact, for a craftsman, it may be the largest thing possible. He made what he could. He made it as well as he could, and it lasted. Chapter 15. The loneliness specific to expertise. There is a kind of loneliness that only comes with being very good at something for a very long time, and it is distinct from ordinary loneliness in ways that are worth naming. Ordinary loneliness is the absence of companionship. The loneliness specific to expertise is more precise than that. It is the absence of people who can fully meet you where you are, who can engage with what you know at the level at which you know it, who can push back against your thinking in ways that actually challenge it rather than simply misunderstanding it. Gehrman has been the most accomplished hunter in the history of Gehrman for what appears to be the entire duration of the hunt's existence. There may have been hunters who approached his level in certain specific ways. Maria certainly did in some respects, and the legends produced by later generations had their own extraordinary qualities. But Gehrman, as a complete practitioner, as someone who understood the hunt both as a craftsman and as a fighter, and as an institution builder and as a teacher, appears to be singular. He is the first and, in some important respects, the deepest version of what a hunter could be. This means he has been, for a very long time, in a position where no one around him fully understood what he understood. The hunters who came through the dream were good, some of them exceptional, but they were encountering him at a moment in their development, a moment early enough that they needed equipping and guidance. They were not his peers. They were his students in the most fundamental sense, people for whom the knowledge he held was still largely ahead of them rather than behind them. He could not have a conversation with them as equals because the nature of the relationship precluded equality. The early hunters, the ones he trained before the dream, were closer to peers. People like Maria, who genuinely mastered what he taught and developed beyond it in their own direction. These were people he could have argued with seriously, whose assessments of the hunt would have carried enough weight to actually make him reconsider things. The loss of this kind of intellectual and practical companionship, the loss of people who could push back against him with credibility, is one of the forms of loneliness. the game does not explicitly name, but that is visible in the structure of his situation. He has no one to argue with. The doll is kind and present and genuinely caring, but she is not a hunter and does not pretend to understand the hunt in the way Gehrman understands it. The hunters who pass through the dream are developing, not developed. He is the person who knows the most about what all of them are doing and what it costs and what it means and what it has produced over the long centuries of its operation, and there is no one who knows it alongside him. This is its own prison within the prison. Gehrman thinks about the hunt, presumably, the way any person thinks about the central project of their life. He has observations about it, refinements of his early understanding, conclusions drawn from the vast accumulated evidence of centuries of watching it operate. He has a perspective on the hunt that no one else in the history of Gehrman could have, because no one else has the combination of his foundational knowledge, his longevity, and his vantage point from inside the dream's particular position relative to everything else. And he cannot share it with anyone who could receive it fully. He can offer the surface of it to passing hunters, practical advice about the night and the beasts and the cost of going too deep. He can speak of the scourge with the authority of someone who has watched it for a very long time. But the deeper understanding, the accumulated perspective of centuries of observation from his specific position sits in him without anywhere fully adequate to go. The loneliness of expertise compounds with the loneliness of time. The longer he is there, the more he knows, and the more he knows, the fewer people are capable of genuinely engaging with what he knows. His expertise becomes, over time, a form of isolation in itself. He is too far into it. He has gone too deep into the specific knowledge of what the hunt is and what it costs, and what it has made of Gehrman for most conversations to reach him where he actually lives. There is a moment in his dialogue where he says something that seems simple, but that carries this weight if you listen to it carefully. He talks about the hunt with a familiarity that is slightly different from ordinary familiarity. It is the familiarity of someone who has been thinking about something for so long that the thinking itself has become a kind of companion. He has been in conversation with the hunt, with the problem of the hunt, with the question of whether the hunt was worth what it cost for longer than any other person has been alive. The hunt is the only interlocutor he has had continuous access to. This is not the relationship he would have chosen. Given the option, he would have had Maria to argue with, or the early hunters, or someone who could stand at his level and take seriously what he had to say and push back in ways that would have made his thinking sharper and his burden lighter, but the option was not given. The dream gave him the doll and the passing hunters and his own mind has been working on the same set of problems for centuries, and the working has produced conclusions that there is no one fully equipped to hear, he mumbles. The mumbling is partly the damage of the centuries, the signal-to-noise degradation of a consciousness that has been running too long in an abnormal environment. But some of the mumbling is also this: the habit of a person who's been talking primarily to himself for a very long time. The things he says out loud are the surface of a much larger internal conversation that has nowhere else to go. He has been the audience for his own thinking for so long that the distinction between internal and external speech has become somewhat notional. What would it have meant to him if someone had arrived in the dream capable of actually receiving what he had to say? Not a hunter in need of equipping, but a genuine interlocutor, someone who understood the hunt at depth and who wanted to know what Gehrman had learned from his particular vantage point over his particular span of time. He would have talked for a very long time, probably. He would have said things that made sense in ways that most of his speech does not quite manage anymore. The expertise would have found its audience, and the finding of it would have been, for him, a form of relief that nothing else in the dream could offer. That person never came. The dream does not produce that kind of encounter. It produces hunters, people in need of what he can provide, and then it dispatches them back into the night. The relationship is always asymmetric, always defined by the difference between what he knows and what they need. The equality that would have made the knowing bearable was not part of the arrangement. He carries it alone. He has always carried it alone. The specific, precise loneliness of a person who knows more than anyone around them about the one thing that matters most to them, and who has nowhere to put that knowledge except back into themselves and into the tools they keep ready for people who cannot yet fully use them. This is Gehrman. Not just the grief, and not just the captivity, and not just the centuries in the garden. Also this, the loneliest expert in the history of a city that produced a remarkable number of people who knew remarkable things, sitting in a dream workshop with tools that hold his wisdom in their geometry, surrounded by flowers that do not change, waiting for someone who knows enough to actually talk to him. No one like that ever came. He made do with what came instead. Chapter 16. The Dream as He Understood It. At some point, probably quite early in his captivity, Gehrman must have attempted to understand the dream in the way that a craftsman understands a material he is working with, by examining it, by testing its properties, by trying to establish what it was and what it could do and what its limits were. This is what he would have done with any new problem. He would have approached it systematically, would have tried to map its logic, would have looked for the mechanism underlying the phenomenon. What he found, presumably, was that the dream does not operate by logic that fully maps onto the categories he had available for thinking about things. It is not a physical space in the ordinary sense, though it has physical qualities. It is not a mental space in the ordinary sense, though it has a relationship to consciousness that ordinary physical space does not. It is something that sits between these categories in a way that makes systematic analysis difficult, because the tools of analysis are themselves part of what the dream has subsumed. He could not think his way out of it. This must have been for a man who had built his entire life around the proposition that problems yield to sufficiently rigorous thinking, an early and devastating discovery. The dream was not a problem of that kind. It did not have a solution accessible to the kind of mind that builds trick weapons and hunting institutions. It required something other than what Gehrman had, or nothing would have worked at all, or both. What he eventually arrived at, the understanding of the dream that he holds by the time we encounter him, seems to be something like acceptance of its fundamental nature without full comprehension of it. He understands that he is in it, and that it is not the world. He understands that the hunters who come through are real people encountering a real danger in the real world, and that the dream is a space that connects to that real danger in ways he cannot fully articulate but can reliably serve. He understands that the moon presence is the dream's author, and that his relationship to the moon presence is one of obligation without consent. Beyond these structural understandings, the dream seems to remain, even after centuries, genuinely strange to him. It does not become ordinary through familiarity. It remains a thing apart from what he knows how to think about, and the centuries have not resolved this strangeness into comprehension. They have only made him more practiced at operating within something he does not fully understand, which is a different thing from understanding it. This is, in its own way, a form of wisdom. Gehrman does not pretend to understand the dream when he does not. He does not offer explanations of it that exceed what he actually knows. His descriptions of the dream to hunters who pass through are practical rather than cosmological. He tells them what it can do for them, how to use it, what to expect from it, without making claims about what it fundamentally is. This epistemic humility, applied to the one subject he has had more opportunity to observe than anything else, suggests that the centuries have taught him something real about the limits of what can be known. The dream, as he has come to understand it, is primarily a relationship. Not a place exactly, or not only a place, but a relationship between him and the moon presence, mediated through the space of the garden and the workshop and the hunters who pass through. He is one end of the relationship. The moon presence is the other. The dream is what the relationship looks like from the inside. This is not a comfortable understanding, but it is an honest one. He has been in relationship with something he cannot fully comprehend, in service of purposes he did not consent to, for longer than any human being should be expected to sustain anything. The dream, understood as a relationship rather than a place, is a relationship that has never been equal and has never been fully transparent and has never, in the centuries of its duration, moved toward resolution. He understands this. He has understood it for a long time. And understanding it has not given him the ability to change it, which is the particular cruelty of insight without agency. He can see the structure of what holds him clearly. He cannot dismantle it. The seeing and the being held coexist without either one resolving the other. What the dream is, as he understands it by the end, is his life. Not in the sense that he accepts it as what life should be, but in the sense that it is the context within which his existence has taken place for so long that the distinction between him and it has become difficult to maintain. He is the dream's warden, yes, but he is also, in some sense, the dream's resident, in a way that has become constitutive. The dream shapes what he is now, as much as his history before the dream does. He is not only the man who was taken, he is also the thing that being taken made him. This understanding does not bring peace. It brings something more modest, a kind of acquaintance with one's own situation that stops short of acceptance, but exceeds mere endurance. He knows what he is. He knows where he is. He knows what it has cost and what it continues to cost. He knows that this knowledge does not change anything, and he knows that too. The dream, as he understands it, is permanent and inescapable, and built specifically to hold him. He has understood this for a long time. He continues anyway, not because he has found a way to make peace with it, but because continuing is what remains when everything else has been foreclosed. He is still in the dream. He still understands it imperfectly. He still tends the workshop and tends the garden and tends the hunters with the same care he has always brought to tending things. Because care is what he is left to offer, and offering it is the only thing he can think of, to do with the time that the dream keeps giving him whether he wants it or not. The dream, as he understands it, is the rest of his life. He makes of it what he can. Chapter 17. The Last Hunter. There is a sense in which Gehrman is not the first hunter, but the last one. He is the person who remains when all the others are gone, the one who has outlasted every student and every colleague and every generation of people who took up the work he built. He is the last hunter in the sense of the one who is still there, when everyone else has moved on, or been consumed, or simply ended in the ordinary way that things end when they are not held in place by a great one's need. The first hunter is the title the game gives him, and it is accurate in its way. He was first chronologically. He built the foundation, he trained the early generation. But the title obscures something about his actual position in the story, which is not that of an origin, but of a remainder. He is what is left. He is the sediment of the hunt's history deposited at the bottom of the dream, while everything that came after him kept moving and changing, and eventually going somewhere else. Every hunter who has passed through the dream and gone back into the night and not returned has left Gehrman as, in a sense, their survivor. He outlives all of them, not because he's stronger or more capable or more deserving of continuation, but because the arrangement the moon presence made requires his continuation regardless of what would naturally happen to him. He survives them all by compulsion rather than by virtue, which is its own particular indignity for a man who built his understanding of the hunt around the idea that what you earned was what you got. The last hunter. The one who is still there. The one who has watched every version of what the hunt produced and has continued to participate in its staging, even as the hunt itself transformed into something he would not have recognized and possibly would not have endorsed. He is the continuity in a history that has otherwise been defined by discontinuity, by the ending of people and movements and moral frameworks and institutional arrangements. He alone has been continuous throughout. This continuity is not a form of triumph. It is a form of the dream's specific cruelty, the insistence that he witness everything without being able to fully participate in anything. He has seen the hunt from its beginning to what may be its culminating moment, the arrival of a hunter capable of disrupting the moon presence's arrangement, and he has seen it from a position that is simultaneously central and marginal. He is essential to the infrastructure of the hunt staging. He has no influence over the hunt itself. The player character who arrives in the dream at the game's beginning is in a sense the last hunter in a different meaning of the term. The last one Gehrman will prepare. The one whose arrival signals something different from the long sequence of arrivals that preceded it. Gehrman cannot fully know this when the hunter first appears. He has presumably had hunters before who seemed exceptional, who went out into the night with unusual capability and did not come back in the ordinary way, but this one is different, in ways that the dream's logic registers even if Gehrman's conscious awareness does not fully process them. He prepares this hunter the same way he has prepared every other hunter. He offers the same practical concern, the same readiness to equip, the same worn and genuine care that has survived the centuries in diminished but intact form. He does not prepare this hunter differently because he knows they are the last one. He prepares them as well as he can because that is what he does. It is all he has left to do. And then the hunter goes out, and the night unfolds, and Gehrman remains in the garden and waits, as he has always waited, as he will wait until the hunter returns, or does not return, until the dream resolves into whatever it resolves into, until the moon presence's arrangement is either fulfilled or disrupted. He waits with the patience of someone who has been waiting for so long that the waiting has become the baseline state rather than an interruption of something else. He is the last hunter in the sense that the game ends with him. Whatever happens in the endings, Gehrman is present at the conclusion of it. He is either the agent of the first ending, or the defeated opponent of the second, or the freed captive of whatever the third ending achieves. He is there, in one form or another, at the place where the story lands. Because he is the one who was there at the beginning and has been there throughout, and the story cannot end without accounting for him. The last hunter tends the workshop. The last hunter sits in the garden. The last hunter waits for the player to make a choice, and then, when the choice is made, accepts its consequences with the equanimity of someone who has been waiting for a consequence for centuries and is no longer in a position to be surprised by what finally arrives. He is the first, he is the last, he is the one who built everything and who remained when everything else was transformed beyond recognition by the forces his building helped to set in motion. He made the hunt. The hunt made him into the last hunter, and the last hunter, when the moment finally came, was still there, still trying, still, against every reasonable expectation, still.